Hi, everybody. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas, Texas on Wednesday, April the 3rd, and welcome to our video commentary. Today, we're going to remember a couple of very important things that happened this week in the presidency of Harry Truman. As you may remember, Harry Truman became president in April 1945 after the death of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. President Roosevelt had been reelected in November to a fourth term, but died with health problems on April 1945. So, as they say, Harry Truman, who was a very unknown person, was put in the position of the presidency and had some very difficult challenges that he faced in 1945, the end of the war in Europe, the end of the war in Japan, the atomic bomb, and then, of course, the economic consequences of bringing back all of those soldiers from the war. So it was a very difficult presidency all the way for President Truman, but today historians rank him pretty high, primarily because of his ability to make tough decisions. And two of the decisions that he made were, number one, the Marshall Plan that was signed into effect on this day in 1948, and the second one was NATO that was signed into, the treaty was signed into effect this week in 1949. Now, the Marshall Plan was called the Marshall Plan because the administrator was General Marshall. It has another fancy name, but it became known as the Marshall Plan, and that's how most people know about it. The purpose of the Marshall Plan was to bring Europe back. Right after the war, most of the European cities were devastated, and during 1945, 1946, 1947, Europe was a mess. There was no jobs, there was no industry, the machinery wouldn't work, the industries had been blown up during the war. So there was a real fear that things in Europe could just fall apart. And there was also the threat of communist uprising. So President Truman, realizing this, put in effect the Marshall Plan. And what the Marshall Plan did was to help many of these countries recover economically. There were 17 countries that participated in the Marshall Plan, and it turned out to be a huge success because within a couple of years, a lot of the European industry, a lot of the work came back, and Europe was able to, to come back as an important economic part of the world. Now, one of the things, of course, that helped the implementation of the Marshall Plan or helping the Europeans get back into shape was the fact that the Americans had a very significant military presence in Europe, just to make sure that everybody knew that the United States was willing to defend Western Europe if it had to. And that leads us to our second memory of the day, and that is NATO, the North American Defense Treaty that was signed on this day in 1949. NATO was basically put together to counter the Soviet Union. At this time in 1949, the big threat in the world was between the West and the East. The West led by the United States, the East by the Soviet Union. There were many fears that the Soviets would walk into Europe and send the tanks in and try to create problems. So NATO was created to counter that, to create a regional alliance, a North Atlantic alliance. It's actually called the North Atlantic Alliance, it has a long name, but that's what it is, North Atlantic. And it worked extremely well. It worked extremely well because it did create that firewall, if you will, that the Soviets understood that if they went into France, for example, or if they went into West Germany, or if they went into the Netherlands or whatever, that that would be an attack on the entire alliance, because Article 5 of the alliance says that an attack on one is an attack on all. So it worked extremely well, and for years, it really kept the peace in Europe. Now, here recently, NATO has been in the news for a different reason, and that is because some of the countries in NATO have not been meeting their financial commitments to NATO. And that has created a lot of problems politically back home here in the United States, because a lot of Americans are saying, wait a minute, why isn't Europe doing what they're supposed to do under the agreement? So that has been a political problem back here and in some of these other countries. But when you look back at NATO, just when you look back at the Marshall Plan, what you really see is two success stories that were brought about because we had a president who understood the big picture and was willing to make unpopular decisions. I mean, look, in 1948, there weren't that many Americans crazy about spending all that money in Europe. They kept saying, why don't we spend it here? And NATO, of course, there were a lot of Americans who said, let them defend themselves. But because of President Truman's leadership, he put these things through, and clearly, many years later, both of these decisions are regarded among some of the best foreign policy decisions of the United States. And that's the reason why President Truman ranks very high when they do the presidential rankings. Well, thank you for watching. We have all of these on YouTube, on Twitter, and on my blog. And if today is your birthday, happy birthday. Bye-bye, everybody.